Dr. Pravir Malik, the founder of QiQuantum. Dr. Pravir has deep interest in the core technologies such as quantum computing, artificial intelligence, genetics, transhumanism, things that just a decade ago might have seemed the stuff of science fiction, but now they are right here, they're being applied in real life, and we have experts like Dr. Pravir to speak about them. Dr. Pravir is a renowned author. He's written 16 books on these topics. He emphasizes a whole systems approach which integrates the individual, the organizational, the economic, the social, the environmental, and evolutionary dimensions. And today, we're going to have him here to share more about these and how we can harness these emerging technologies for the new possible. Remember, the theme of our conference this year is Rethink What's Possible. Welcome, Pravir. Over to you.
Welcome. I'm Pravir Malik, and I'm founder of QiQuantum. And today I'll be sharing some thoughts on harnessing light-based emerging technologies for the new possible. The structure of my talk is going to be essentially threefold. I will lay out an alternative light-based quantum computation approach very briefly and suggest how we can capitalize on that. I will then suggest some applications that will have a huge impact on the business world. And finally, I'll suggest that this is possible quickly, and I'll summarize these slides as well as I get toward the end. So capitalizing on light-based quantum computation, essentially, the way to think about this is that what is really quanta? So quanta can be thought of as a bridge mechanism between some invisible layer and the visible layer of light. And we can think of quanta as essentially materializing this information in a particular way. When we think of quanta in this way, then it opens up a different possibility for quantum computation, as I'm going to go over in the next few minutes. The easiest way to get a handle on how quantum computation could be different is by thinking about something I call reverse extrapolation. So let's think about all matter and life as it arises and look at life in its structure of the cell, a living cell, which it can be either a plant cell or an animal cell or a human cell. And when we look at that, we'll notice that there's a particular architecture to it. There's a fourfold architecture in which there are known molecular plants that we call lipids, polysaccharides, nucleic acids, and proteins. And if we ask, really, what's the organizational principle behind each of these molecular plants, we'll see that proteins are workhorse elements. There's, after all, over 30,000 different proteins in the human cell, and they do all kinds of work. Nucleic acids create the libraries in cells and the knowledge of how all components should act. And therefore, we can think about it as a carrier of an organizational principle of knowledge. Polysaccharides are sugars which provide energy in the cell. And so we can think about it as a carrier for the organizational principle of energy of power. And lipids create natural compartments in cell that allow work specialization and therefore harmony. And we can think about it as materializing a principle of harmony. So I want to draw attention to these four principles, which I summarize as power, presence, knowledge, and harmony. Now, the interesting thing is, why am I sharing this? Because this is the manifest layer of life. But if we go back into matter, then we also find that the same four categories can organize all atoms in the periodic table and also organize all quantum particles at the quantum level. So let's very briefly look at the periodic table just to draw that analogy. And we'll see that it's organized as S shell, P shell, D shell, and F shell. And if we think about the S shell elements, we find in there atoms like hydrogen and helium. And we know, for example, that hydrogen and helium power stars due to nuclear fusion. And we can therefore say that that's really, the S shell is a representative of the organizational principle of power or energy. When we think about D shell, we find a lot of industrial elements, things like aluminum, copper, iron, steel, cobalt, and so on. And we know that these are responsible for creating all the infrastructure that we see around us. And so this, we can say, the D shell is a representative of this organizational principle of presence. When we think about the P shell, we find in it elements like silicon and carbon, and we know that these are the basis of computing machinery and then of life and mental life. And also we find other atoms in here which are archetypes of a range of different elements. And so we can say, therefore, that the P shell is a carrier of the organizational principle of knowledge. And when we look at the F shell, then we can see that these are experiments in collectivity at the atom level, because we find atoms with the highest atomic number, meaning that they have the most neutrons, protons, and electrons, and up to 108 that's known in terms of known elements. And therefore, we can say that the F shell elements are a carrier of this organizational principle of harmony. So we find the same architecture also existing here at levels smaller than in the cell. And then when we extrapolate backwards, we find also that all quantum particles are structured into quarks, leptons, bosons, and Higgs bosons. And I can make the case, and by the way, I've written extensively about this in a number of journal articles and a number of books, but we find that quarks can also be a carrier particle of the principle of knowledge. Leptons, carrier particles of the principle of power or energy. Bosons can be a particle for the principle of harmony, and the Higgs boson of presence. So now, naturally, the question is, if we find that all visible life and matter is organized by these four principles, then it stands to reason that even when we look at the quantum level, these principles must in fact be emanating from there. And therefore, this gives us a clue as to how to look at the quantum level and how to approach quantum computation. So this is the second key element that I'm proposing exists in a light-based quantum computation, and it has huge repercussions for how we create quantum computation, computing machinery, and also has huge repercussions in terms of downstream industries that will be affected by this approach. Finally, I also want to draw attention to this fact that when we think about all visible matter in life, they are the result of what I call a persistent quantum computation. After all, if we look around us, there's stability to things, and there's a particular way in which things continue to behave. And this, I would argue, is only a result of this output of this persistent quantum computation that shows up as genetic type information. Now, when we look at the cell, we are aware of genetic information because we know that genes exist in cells. But I also suggest that even as we extrapolate backwards into the level of atoms or quantum particles or the quantum veil itself, we will find similar genetic type information that accompanies each of the surfacings of matter and life and suggests or dictates to these emergences how they should behave in the universe. So this is the third element in this light-based quantum computation approach. Now the question is, what are the implications of that? Before I get to the implications, I want to suggest also how this is different from existing quantum computation approaches. So there are companies like Google, IBM, Honeywell, SciQ, amongst numerous others, Microsoft, for example, that are all focused on what I would call the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. I mean, that's the basis that they've used for how they approach quantum computation. And the basic principle there is, I call it black box adherence, simply because in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, what is stated is that you can never know the reality of what's happening at the quantum level. All you can do is observe, and the moment you observe and measure something, it will collapse into something that's measurable. And so by definition, what you're measuring is twice removed from reality because you're measuring a symbol of some reality. And therefore, you can never know what's behind. In contrast, as I've just suggested, in this light-based quantum computation, we have, due to reverse extrapolation, we can suggest what's happening at the quantum level. And this has implications because if we look at the nature of the molecular plans in cells, or we look at the nature of atoms, or even the nature of different quantum particles, we will find that there's a specific function that accompanies anything that arises. For example, hydrogen is fundamentally different from helium, which is fundamentally different from silver. And the properties of these things remain the same no matter where they operate in the universe. And so we can say that there's a function that's driving whatever is manifesting. And I've developed, in fact, over the series of 10 volumes of books, a mathematics that actually shows this, how this fourfold function operates. And so this would become the basis of a new computing paradigm, quantum computational paradigm. Finally, I also want to suggest that due to this reverse extrapolation, there's a very interesting corollary, which is that whatever we see happening at the quantum level is also happening at the level of atoms and the level of cells. And the fact that we have this fourfold organization and intricate functionality suggests that. And so that also gives us an insight into how to approach quantum computation differently. Now, what are the implications of this? Now, the implications are that we will break through existing technological barriers. And of course, the business implications of this are huge because currently we are limited by the size of quantum computers. But in this approach, because we're using stable atoms, molecules, and photons, which are all can operate at room temperature, they don't require, as does, say, a computer that's created, the quantum computer that's created by IBM or Google, to operate at 0 Kelvin. And they also become very, very scalable as a result of being able to operate or be built on atoms and photons. The lifetime of quantum states is now also based on these stable atoms, and it'll far exceed the qubit lifetime that's being engineered in such computers that are being created by IBM and Google. Gates are also built using photons and atoms, which means they are much more reliable and stable. And as I suggested, there's a fourfold mathematics that can be used to operate these computers. And this, as opposed to the black spot in adherence, where there is, what you're trying to do is engineer entanglement and superposition. In the light-based approach, there's pre-existing entanglement and superposition, which means that these can be leveraged in a completely different way. And then finally, one of the big challenges today in quantum computers that are being developed is that there is a maximum of 95% accuracy due to decoherence. The manufactured qubits can decohere based on environmental impacts. But because atoms and molecules are already proven to be completely stable, we can in fact create a computer that will be 100% accurate, which again has huge implications for the business world. Now, there's also tremendous implications for the entire technology stack. So what we're saying is that the hardware will be fundamentally different. It's based on this idea of reverse extrapolation of quanta that materializes information. And it's also based on proven quantum technologies such as exist in LED, MRI, GPS, and so on. So that's another feature of this. And therefore, as we extrapolate or look upward as to all the different companies that can be created, there can be a layer of companies that would then be dealing with the control systems, which would ensure the integrity of the circuits that really animate the hardware. Then there would be another layer of companies that deal with various kinds of software that are based on this functional mathematics algorithms. And then finally, there would be a whole slew of applications that would allow interpretation, testing, and basically the generation of quantum phenomena completely differently. And so we can hypothesize, or we can see that the entire industry would evolve completely differently, and there would be instead of the billions of dollars that are being invested today into what I'd call a questionable approach, there's now the implication that we can create a much more feasible, tangible set of companies that actually are being able to manipulate the quantum level much more accurately. So this has huge business implications. Some applications, very briefly, because at its base we have proven quantum technology, as I mentioned, such as GPS, MRI, LED, and laser, and it's the quantum mechanics that exist in these proven technologies that's being leveraged in this light-based approach to create specific applications that I call nano-cyborg applications. And some immediate areas are in medical technology and material sciences. So for example, to quickly give an idea, so in medical technology, we could have a cell that maybe is not healthy. And then we could have a healthy cell, and we can, due to this the light-based quantum computer can superpose the healthy functioning onto the unhealthy functioning and then shift how the unhealthy cell is functioning. Similarly, there can be a number of impacts or essentially approaches in material sciences where we can fundamentally, I'm proposing, create different kinds of materials, again, through taking various kinds of functions, combining them, and then precipitating them in a particular kind of way to engender or birth different kinds of materials. So there's also massive implications for that. I just want to mention that this is all based on, over the last 3 to 4 years, I've published about 15 journal and IEEE conference papers. And so everything that I've spoken about, everything that I've suggested has been peer reviewed, and I've also gotten a number of different awards in this work. And this itself is based on the deeper set of books that I've written that enumerate the mathematics in much more detail. And I want to draw attention to the last 4 books, which are applications in the cosmology of light. And there's the Emperor's Quantum Computer that essentially looks at the current paradigm and then suggests what I've briefly summarized over here in a few minutes in more detail. And so, what are the implications for these different quantum computers? There's also a look at genetics in a different way, because I'm proposing that the origins of genetics are this persistent quantum computation, and so there's huge repercussions downstream for that. There's repercussions for artificial intelligence, because our current paradigm of artificial intelligence looks at, essentially considers conceptual spaces that are created by the mind and then tries to operate within that. But here we're fundamentally saying that there's a light-based edifice that starts from the quantum level, and matter itself has a huge amount of intelligence embedded in it, and it needs to be leveraged differently. And then the final book, Triumph of Love, is about transhumanism, which will suggest different ways to transcend human limits. And this is, of course, a huge focus of technology today. But I'm suggesting that with the light-based quantum computation and the genetics that arises from it, there's a completely different way to do it. And so there's huge repercussions, again, for these industries. So very briefly, the new possible, if we look at the number of quantum patents that exist today, they're literally maybe around a couple of thousand for an industry that's supposed to be billions of dollars in about 10 years. But if you consider the light-based approach, then you can see right away with the impact on genetics and artificial intelligence that you can create thousands of more patents, and this would really open out what's possible. So with that, I want to just quickly summarize that if we think about the technologies, the proven quantum technologies that exist today, such as MRI, GPS, LED, and so on, then I'm suggesting that we can use those dynamics that already exist to create a number of different devices fairly quickly and at a much lower price point. So it's not billions of dollars, it's millions of dollars. And so we would see the result of that within a few years. And again, this has huge repercussions for all downstream industries. So just summarizing really quickly, what I'm suggesting is that the components of quantum computation need to be rethought based on light. I'm suggesting that we would overcome the inevitable dead end assured by just following the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, because by definition, in that interpretation, we can never see what's really happening behind the veil. When we consider photons and atoms, we will break through a number of technological barriers that exist today. There will be a completely new technology stack with huge business repercussions that can be built. There will be a number of nano cyborg applications, and I pointed out a couple in medical technologies, material sciences, but then also to impact a number of downstream industries. As I suggested, all of this has been already peer reviewed and has appeared in a number of numerous IEEE technical publications. I'm suggesting there's a churning out of thousands of new patents that are possible. I quickly displayed a representative plan that can show the quick impact. And essentially, the bottom line is that with this different approach, there's going to be a different quantum computing industry that arises. There's going to be implications for downstream industries. And so there's essentially a huge opportunity from the business side. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you.